Looks like everybody's good. All right. Well, Ruben, thanks for the heads up. And what an incredible singing time. Also the message, encouragement message for sharing what God has given. And also Ed, that's a very, very touching, encouraging, and also I think very just adventurous story that you yourself experienced, and then now you can share, help us imagine what Paul went through. Thank you so much. I'm gonna think about this story quite a bit. Thank you. And I want to thank the care team because I personally owe you a thanks for so generously coming up with topics that might interest us on Sundays like this. And the topics that I picked was happiness and joy. And like last week, we talked about happiness already. Manjai listened to the message, and then she came to me and said I listened to your message, and then I am overcome with a profound sadness. That's when you know you did a good job. That lesson last week, it went a bit long, which is an understatement, because I went home and I reviewed the recording, and then I dozed off with the lights on. That's when I understand this English expression that says, get a taste of your own medicine. Anyway, that was last week, happiness. And I promise that if God's willing, then this week we can talk about joy. So here we are, we're supposed to talk about joy. So hopefully I learned my lesson, because I make sure this week's note is at least 1 page shorter than last week. Hopefully that already bring you a little joy. So as I got all these inputs and feedbacks from not just the care team, but some Jamie gave me a lot of inputs as well. So I was looking at all these input, and what I can summarize from what we're thinking about joy is that a couple of things. I think we all agree that experiencing joy is essential to our overall well-being. Joy is this inexplicable exhilaration that would come with having a relationship with someone. Hopefully that's God, right? And I think we all also agree that the ability to experience joy is important even during hard times. So I got all this input, and I didn't get anybody saying joy, get it away from me, I don't need that. So I think we all want to have joy. And I believe our loving care team would love that we all can experience joy, hence the suggestion. So in this lesson, I will try to focus on 2 parts. The first is that I will first talk about what I believe is the most fundamental principle of a joyful life according to the Bible, or at least according to how I read the Bible. And then I will focus on some down-to-earth practices that everyone can practice, and that it would train us to live a joyful life. So, 2 parts. Okay, ready? One thing that really stood out to me from all the inputs was this keen awareness that the importance of knowing how to find joy during hard times. I believe that's a great observation. And if you already think like that, you already have a lot of great companies in the Bible. For example, the story that Ed just told. New Testament was written in Greek, and the word for joy is chara. So I was looking up where we can find this. A lot of the apostles talk about joy together with hardships. For example, James. James, in his letter in the 1st chapter, he said, whenever you face trials of any kind, consider it pure joy, because your endurance can produce strong faith. And then Peter said similar things in the first letter of Peter, 1st chapter, verse 6. He says, Rejoice even if now for a little while you have had to suffer various trials. Why? Because again, endurance produces strong faith. And talk about Paul. Paul wrote the letter to the Philippians church while he was in prison. And if you read Paul's letter, usually at the end it would come with this section of fundraising. Because he was traveling. He's a traveling preacher. He would collect funds and bring it to the next church or Jerusalem church that would need help. But in this letter to the Philippians church, there was no fundraising whatsoever because he just didn't know if he's going to survive this one. But also, the tone of the letter to the Philippians, among all his letters, is one of the most tender ones. And in this letter that he didn't know if he would survive, he wrote 5 times the word chara, joy. So you have great companies already in the Bible when you think about, joy, hardship. And then in the Old Testament as well, out of all the books, which book do you think mentioned the word joy, simcha, that's Hebrew, the most number of times? Psalms. That's a good guess. But no, it's Ecclesiastes. One of the most miserable book in the whole Bible has the most number of mentioning of the word simcha, joy. So yes, joy somehow we have intuitive sense that has to do with suffering at the same time, right? Side by side. The Bible agrees with us to this point. Now, we are on a good start. But I think to continue talking about joy and suffering, we need to ask better questions. Because I don't think you're interested in the question of what. What is joy? What is suffering? If I ask you, what is suffering? You can come up here, give me a sermon, or you can come up here and step on my toe, right? I guarantee you that's gonna make me understand suffering better than 10 sermons can tell me. So we're not interested in the question of what, but interested of why and how. How to make sense of suffering and miseries, how to navigate sufferings, and how to find joy. It's not just because the fact that I'm suffering, but why I'm going through these things. That's the real question that interests most of us, I guess all of us. But there's still one problem, because asking the question why things happen, suffering, that's not just one way to explain the same pain on the toe. There's not just one way to explain sufferings. There are so many ways to make sense of sufferings, and that always depends on the culture around us, what shapes how we think. For example, in some cultures that look at the world with a dualistic mindset, like there's this eternal battle between the forces of the good and the forces of the evil. And if I think like this, if this is where I live, I would tend to explain miseries as some kind of evil forces working against me. In some other cultures, where they look at the world as just endless cycle of death and rebirth, reincarnation, cause and effect, and if this is how I look at the world, then I would tend to look at my suffering as just part of this long process of self-perfection, right? Same pain, totally different interpretation. So how we make sense of pain, suffering, is decided by our worldview. Now, which means that every time we try to talk about our suffering, we're not actually talking about suffering, we are actually expounding our worldview. And any disagreement in what suffering really means, imagine things really happen, people argue. This is actually a clash of worldviews. And now the question for us, since we're in a church, is that, is there a worldview that is unique to the Bible? And is my worldview is the same as the one that's in the Bible, if there's any? I believe that's a question that interests most of us as we talk about joy and suffering. And so to to go on this direction, I think I'm bringing us into a tricky business right now. Because every time when we want to talk about the underlying worldview, I run the risk of challenging people's belief. Sometimes it can get uncomfortable. But it's okay. You're glowing your eye.
I said do it.
Do it? Well, yeah, it might just happen right here today. But I just want you to know that you really, you're not required to agree with what I say. You never have to agree with what I say. You always know that. Just, learning is an adventure, right? You just want to make sure you know the freedom that you always have, all right? So, talking about a worldview. Last week, when we talked about happiness, I already proposed a biblical worldview. Here, let me just summarize it for you. So, last week we talked about, basically, this whole story of the world is that God, single and alone, lacking nothing himself, just decided on his own that he wanted to create a good and habitable world that favors life, prosperity, happiness, and then he put all these creatures here to call this place home. And one of those creatures are us. And out of all these creatures, he made us his caretakers to take care of this place on his behalf. But the caretakers rebelled. And then the rest of the Bible is stories about disciplining, training, teaching these caretakers, you and I, to return to the right path by doing what is just, what is right, to honor God, just as God has always been doing what is just and right and staying loyal to his creation and us. And so by redeeming the humankind, the world can be redeemed. I illustrated this worldview using three major movements in the Bible: the story of creation, story of preservation, and story of redemption. If you have listened to the lesson last week, I think you remember that. So now we're talking about worldview. When we read the Bible this way, it has a huge implications on how we make sense of life's misery and consequently how to find joy. Because unlike virtually every culture throughout history, for the most part, the Bible doesn't have things like demigods and demons going around being troublemakers, and you have all these fancy stories. We don't find that. There's no such thing in the Bible as God or goddesses in charge of sickness and health, or war or peace, God of famine and God of harvest, God of poverty, God of prosperity. Because if the Bible is like this, then when we read it, it would be a lot like Greek mythology or Chinese mythology or even like Nordic mythology. Like every phenomenon would be explained by some kind of god or demon or goddesses just like acting behind the scene. That would be the story in the Bible. Sarah is childless because, the moon goddess was jealous. Or David committed adultery with Bathsheba because Loki was pulling the string behind the scene. Or like Paul, talking about Paul. Paul had a shipwreck because Poseidon was having a war with Zeus. But like Ed just said, no. In the story, what happened was Paul actually thanked the Creator. There's no such fancy stories, no mythology in the Bible. So this mythological worldview is actually way more normal. It's basically normative in all human cultures, I think including ours if we pay attention to it. And part of the reason is that it is a human tendency to want to find explanation to our sufferings, because having pain is one thing. Having no explanation for the pain that I'm going through, that's a whole different level of hell altogether, right? But if pain and suffering can be somewhat explained by what's going on in the spiritual realm, that there's these two opposing forces fighting, that's why I'm suffering, then guess what? There's always hope that eventually that balance might tilt to my favor. So just having this hope alone might make pain easier to bear. So that's why mythological thinking, it's just so common across all cultures in all history. Then comes the Bible, and the Bible doesn't fit in this model. When it talks about the world was being created, it was just one God. When the flood happened, it was God. And when Hannah needed a child, she prayed to the same God. And when Jesus was protesting on the cross, when he was dying, he screamed at the same God. There's only one God, the Creator, and nothing takes place without his permission. We sing a lot of songs today to thank God and to praise God. Those are great songs, and I was very encouraged. But I was just wondering also that, in good times, I can thank God for his kindness, and that's easier. But what about in bad times? Where would my finger point to? It has to be to the same God, because there is no other. And that is a very hard thing to do. This is called biblical monotheism. This is the worldview of the Bible, a radical monotheism. And compare this kind of worldview to the mythological thinking. Monotheism is not easy at all, especially when we're dealing with suffering, because it doesn't take the easy way out like mythological thinking. Biblical faith is not for the faint-hearted. And I think because this is human nature to want to, have lesser pain or feel lesser pain, biblical monotheism is always a challenge, even for Christians like us. And I want to propose a little litmus test. And the litmus test on how we understand biblical monotheism is how we read the book of Job, which is the book of suffering. Ever read the book of Job? So Job, in Hebrew, Eov, is this blameless man who was in deep, deep misery because he lost everything overnight. And there was just no way to get out of that situation. For him, once he was stricken by God, every other breath that was left of him was to suffer. And every thought that came to him was that the fact that he was suffering. So he cried out to God, who is unseen, and he said, why have you done this to me? Explain it to me. And then he has these three friends who said, you can't talk to God like that. Who are you to talk to God like that? And after this really long back and forth between these four old dudes, God finally spoke. Finally, in chapter 38, into it, God spoke through the storm, and he said, Job was right. And these three amigos, they're wrong. Even then, God did not explain why Job had to suffer. Job never got an answer. Just the fact that God acknowledged his cry, was enough to comfort Job. So Job's last words was basically, I will now zip up. But as hard as it was for Job, at least he got an acknowledgement from God. What can be worse? What if God just stays silent throughout? Completely silent. What do we do then? Well, it does get worse, because this is where Psalms 88 comes in. So I'm going to read it to you, the whole Psalms 88, and I will read it from the Revised English Bible, which is published by Oxford and Cambridge. I think, it's not available on the apps that we use. So I'm just going to read it to you. You don't have to worry about looking for it. And fair warning ahead, if you think Job is dark, it's going to get even darker. Psalm 88. Lord my God, by day I call for help, by night I cry aloud in your presence. Let my prayer come before you. Hear my loud entreaty, for I have had my fill of woes which have brought me to the brink of Sheol. I am numbered with those who go down to the abyss. I have become a man beyond help, abandoned among the dead like the slain lying in grave, who you hold in mind no more, who are cut off from your care. You have plunged me into the lowest abyss, into the darkest regions of the depths. Your wrath bear heavily on me. You have brought on me all your fury. You have removed my friends far from me and made me utterly loathsome to them. I am shut in with no escape. My eyes are dim with anguish. Lord, every day I have called you and stretched out my hands in prayer. Will it be for the dead that your work wonders? Or can the shades rise up and praise you? Will they speak in the grave of your love, of your faithfulness in tomb? Will your wonders be known in the region of darkness, your victory in the land of oblivion? As for me, Lord, I cry to you. My prayer comes before you in the morning. Lord, why have you cast me off? Why did you hide your face from me? From childhood I have suffered and been near to death. I have borne your terrors. I am numb. Your burning fury swept over me. Your onslaughts have overwhelmed me. All the day long they surge around me like the flood. From every side they close in on me. You have taken friend and neighbor far from me. Darkness is now my only companion. Sorry for the bleakness. But that was it. That was it, the whole song. There was no comfort, no answers, no hope, except one single voice cry out in the darkness to the one and only God who stayed silent. So, I picked the story of Job, and I picked this psalm, the darkest of all psalms, to illustrate to you what biblical monotheism really demands of us. Something can only show its true colors when it is in extreme circumstances. And in this case is how one person worship God. Talking about worship God, the basic requirement is, I'm sure you have heard of the Ten Commandments, right? The head of the Ten Commandments is this, that you shall have no other gods before me. Literally, do not follow other gods before me. And there's also this greatest commandments according to Jesus, which I'm sure we all have mentioned multiple times in this year, even, teaching. And this comes from Deuteronomy chapter 6, where it says, Hear, O Israel, Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. So, hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord only. The Lord only. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your hearts, with all your soul, with all your strength. These are the basic requirements to worship God. And if we truly want to obey these commands, even to the darkest hours, and I do mean the darkest hours, God forbid, how do we still love this Lord our God with all our hearts, when the heart is all shattered, with all our soul, when the soul is all withered, and with all our strength, when the only strength left is to feel the pain? Remember, Job, in the story, Job did not know from the beginning to the end why he had to suffer. But guess who knows? Other than, God. Us, readers. We know that he had to suffer. And the reason was because of this absolutely unnecessary bet between the accusing angel and God. And the accusing angel was basically betting that Job, he told God, Job would just give up honoring you if you take away all the blessings, all the positive reasons for Job to honor you. And God took out the bet, which Job did not know. Why? He did not know this at all. He just knew that all of a sudden he was suffering. And so for Job, that question that we began our lesson in the beginning, when we said, how can I find joy at times of trouble? That question has already gone out the window. In Job's story, it was by God's decree that Job would have no more reason for joy, and no one can change what God has decreed. So, hypothetically speaking, if that happens, what then? How do we still obey the command that says, you shall have no other gods before me? When, this is what I mean by pushing our worship to the extreme. Perhaps then we can have our own Psalms 88. And this is what it means to worship the one and only God, because there is really no other. No other powers is worthy enough to make things happen behind God's back. That no other powers that we can point the fingers to. And so to make excuse for God about our suffering, in this case, is to deny God, is to deny God's doing. There is truly no other, no one else to put the blame on besides God. And, we should not ever hope to be tested like this, except to know that what we are seeing is faith at its finest. This is what it means that you shall have no other gods besides me. And this is the kind of faith that Jesus himself had to go through until his very last breath. We all know the story of the crucifixion very well. When he was about to die on the cross, did he say, "The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing"? No, he did not say that. Instead, he cried out in a loud voice in Aramaic, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani." My God, why have you forsaken me? And then he took his last breath and he died. That was his final worship. So, this is the biblical worldview, biblical monotheism. It is not an easy road to walk. It is way harder than we would like it to be. Therefore, on the other hand, the mythological thinking, with all its ready-made, easy to swallow explanation of our suffering, is very easy to fall back to. It is just human tendency to want to have explanation for our pain. And we Christians are human through and through. We too are susceptible to the attractiveness of mythological thinking. So, what kind of extra biblical worldviews there are around us that can be affecting how we Christians think? Even in this challenge, we're not alone. It's been with Christians throughout Christian history. In 1945, in the town called Nag-Hammadi in Egypt, a local farmer boy found a collection of early Christian writings that dates back to sometime in between the 2nd and the 4th century, so very early on. And this collection of 52 writings are now collectively known as the Nag-Hammadi Library. And for over 1,000 years, there have been rumors about these writings, mostly from people who mention them as like writings by the heretics. But no one had access to it. No one could read what they really say until 1945. And so for the first time, we can finally read these documents. Well, turns out these are treatises, like scholarly publications by very highly educated Christians in Lower Egypt who are steeped in the Gospels and who are steeped in Paul's letters and also steeped in Greek philosophies, especially Plato. And even though they were later being denounced by other mainstream Christians as heretics, it is important for us to understand that there was no conspiracy among these Christians. There's no nefarious agenda, like purposely trying to corrupt Christianity. It's not like that. They were Christians doing their best efforts to understand the Bible, to build up their knowledge, to build up their faith. But their underlying worldview was that of the Plato influence. Plato taught that, Plato is this very influential Greek philosopher. And this is grossly just summarizing his not fair, I think, but in general, Plato taught that the physical world that we can see is not the real, not the true forms, but what is real, what is truth, is non-physical, and therefore is timeless, and it is absolute. Our body belongs to this physical world, but our, whatever you call it, our true self, our essence, should belong to that non-physical forms, which is pure, timeless, and absolute. And our goal in life should be about pursuing this true self, to perfect this true self. And that's what knowledge is all about. This kind of philosophy is called dualism. Dual, like, two opposing sides. Therefore, dualism. Mind, body, separated. True, abstract reality versus inferior physical reality. So dualism. And the writings of the Nag Hammadi Christians that we can now read shows that they are strongly influenced by Plato. These writings say that the world that we have is actually created by a lesser, a misguided being who is the opponent of the true God. And we, human beings, we're trapped in this inferior world, but Jesus, who is from that true God, who came into this world and imparted us, or the selected people, with real knowledge, the truth. And the truth is basically to tell you what's happening behind the scenes. This is what's happening. And therefore, people who have this knowledge, this truth, will eventually escape this inferior realm and to be with that true God. And the Nag Hammadi Christians, in their attempts to explain how all this works, they came up with elaborated mythologies with like layers of like heavenly entities and gods and things like that, male, female gods, to explain our human condition, like good versus evil, joy versus suffering, superior versus inferior. And the spiritual practice is not like what Ruben was saying. It's not about improving the world. Because why would you do that? That would be helping that opponent of God, this world that belongs to them, that enemy of God. Instead, they huddled up and they refrained from participating in the wider world, so to prevent themselves from being polluted by the world, so that one day their spirit can be free from this inferior body and to escape this inferior world and return to the true God. Now, they were obviously later denounced by other Christians as heretics. Nowadays, now that we can read the documents, scholars group the Nag Hammadi library as one of the Gnostic literature. I'm sure as you listen to these things, my guess is that you probably can sense that a lot of these sounds kind of familiar to us nowadays. That's an important lesson for us. The important lesson that was for these ancient Christians and as for us is that nobody reads the Bible free of our cultural influences, the culture that we live around us. Obviously, we encourage people to read the Bible. Important as it is to examine the scripture, it is just as important, if not more important, to examine the person who reads, basically us, we ourselves, especially the cultural assumptions that we just automatically bring into our way of reading the scripture. Now, obviously, this is a very difficult thing to do, which is why I think teaching is such a demanding task. A lot of this responsibility does lie with the one who teach. Now, are we still under the influence of dualistic thinking nowadays? I think we are. And if we don't want to point it out and we just go with the flow, we might just end up looking like the Nag Hammadi Christians. How does dualistic thinking in the year 2023 affect how we make sense of our suffering and joy? Last week, we already mentioned that there's this popular skepticism among Christians about happiness. And there are many reasons, but one of the reasons I believe comes from this idea that worldly pleasures come from the devil, and God will be displeased with me if I take part in pleasure. And it is also not uncommon to hear the teachings that portray our lives, our personal lives, as basically a battleground in a war that's in between Jesus and Satan. And on the surface, looks like Satan maybe having an upper hand that explains my misery, but in reality, that's just Satan's last hurrah, because Jesus is going to come back and Jesus is going to defeat this Satan once and for all, and I'll be at this forever happy place, being joyful forever. But right now, Satan is just doing his best to distract me from this truth. But as long as I do not forget this future joy, then I can essentially ignore the pain and just do not let my life misery affect me too much. That is mythological thinking. Without the Old Testament as the backbone to teach us what is biblical monotheism, it is very easy for anybody to read the New Testament in this kind of dualistic thinking. There's another very famous early Christian named Marcion, who is only 2 generations younger than the apostles. And he was a huge fan of the Apostle Paul. Biggest fan ever. And just like the Nag Hammadi Christians, he was also heavily influenced by Plato's teaching. When he read Paul's letter, he found that the Old Testament is so incompatible with how he read the New Testament that he basically outright rejected all of Old Testament. He said that there are actually different gods. The Old Testament God is a completely different God than the New Testament God. And if you ever heard this idea, this saying that the God of the Old Testament is the God of wrath, and the New Testament God is the God of love, well, it is Marcion's invention. And he too was later denounced as heretic. That was the first part. Like I said, talking about worldview. And I know that's heavy stuff. But why do I spend so much time talking about biblical monotheism compared to other worldviews that are affecting Christianity today? You see, biblical monotheism, according to the Bible, is the best way to live. And Paul made the same argument in the letters to the Romans. In the first chapter, this is his whole argument, that human being was created to live as monotheist. But then, of course, everything went sideways after that. That's the rest of his chapter. Even though we know that there are people in life who has gone to really dark places, like Job or Jesus, where being alive is nothing but pure torture. But very few of us here have actually experienced that. Me neither. Thank God. But then when we look at the story of Job and Jesus and look at Psalms 88, if radical monotheism means not letting God off the hook, even in the worst of times, then how much more will this person acknowledge God in everything in life? During good times, so-so times, meh times, all the time. You see, dualism teaches us that joy is somewhere far away. And joy is to do this mental escape from life. But that's not a good way to live, according to the Bible. This dualism does affect many ways we interpret the Bible. For example, we misinterpreted the greatest commandments, according to Jesus, to fit this dualistic worldview. When we read that you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, we usually say the soul means my spirit, that non-physical thing, the true self that is in me, the essence of me. Except that the word soul came from the Hebrew word nephesh, which means the physical me, the flesh. Therefore, a better way to translate the greatest commandment into our current day-to-day language is this: to love the Lord your God with all your intellect and emotions, with all your flesh, and when you do all these things, put in your best. This commandment, putting it in that way, is teaching us to experience God in all the mundane, boring stuff in life, like a glass of water that quench my thirst, or a roof over my head that protects me, a roof under the floor, under my foot, that keep me grounded. Are these not from God? Are these not reasons to be joyful? With dualism, we're encouraged to see all these as distractions from the truth. Dualism encourages escapism, but with radical monotheism, we will have radical gratitude. But then, of course, we're all humans, right? Humans tend to filter out all these mundane stuff, like floor. Whenever you walk on the floor and you say, like, thank you, God, for the floor. You know, it's human. We tend to not pay attention to all these things. And there's a human psychology called cognitive bias. We need to be able to filter out all this mundane stuff in order to, say for our ancestors in the forest, to detect potential dangers. In the forest, there's full of all kinds of things and noise and everything to see, to detect perhaps that's a tiger. And therefore, the ability to filter out mundane stuff is our survival technique, which is why, our ancestors lived long enough to produce babies, and then you and I are here, talking about them. Therefore, not taking things for granted is not an easy thing to do. It's against our human nature in many ways, and it requires us to be able to master over this tendency. It requires training, and that's the beauty of the Sabbath. In the story of the Exodus, when the Israelites left Egypt, and after a few weeks of traveling in the wilderness, they finished eating all the unleavened bread and there was no more food. And that's when God came in and started providing manna. But God, every time, only provided just enough for the day. The Israelites are required to go outside to gather the manna. In other words, they are required to work for it. So they did this on the first day, second day, third day, fourth day, fifth day, and then on the sixth day, something different happened. God provided double portion. Why? Because the seventh day would be Sabbath, and God is not going to provide any. But God provided double portion on the sixth day. And then this cycle keeps going on for 40 years in the wilderness. This is basically a training. And the educational values for the Israelites are that, first of all, they're learning that the true masters are not like the old masters in Egypt. These new masters take care of you. But whereas in the past, you were in Egypt and you faced the danger of not getting enough, now you face a new and maybe a bigger danger, which is to start taking God's generosity for granted. And so the Sabbath was to train them to just take a pause every now and then, so that they can recognize and to appreciate all that God has provided. For 6 days, you shall work for what you do not yet have. But for 1 day, you appreciate what you are already given. And for 6 days, you can occupy yourselves with you making a living, but for just 1 day, you simply live. This is teaching us that joy cannot be pursued. It can only be encountered. But first, we need to learn to make space, learn to make time, so that we can see and appreciate all that God has given us. And chief among all that God has given us is relationships. We need to open ourselves up for these kind of surprises now and then, and to take a moment to thank the one who provides. That's how we encounter God, not by escaping this life, but by going deep into the life. In August, I did another lesson called Ecclesiastes and Rediscovering the Art of Spending Time Together, which has, we go into a little bit more detail in this part, this kind of stuff called, spending time together, making time. We have the video available. I think it will be helpful if you would like to revise it. So Sabbath is this perpetual training, perpetual recalibration of our attention and keeping us from falling back into the habit of taking things for granted. Just like Jesus said, Sabbath is created for humankind, not humankind for Sabbath. Another very simple practice that all of us here know, all of us have done, and all of us should not give up doing, is this simple thing about praying before taking a meal, just to give thanks to God for providing food for us. It's just that simple, right? And don't just let it stop you from doing it for the meal. We can do it for everything. The water, if you drive, even if the traffic jam, we have a car to drive. We can extend this practice to everything in life. And my children are, in many ways, teachers for me, because every night, maybe not every night, but many nights, they would come bug me and my wife to pray with them before they go to sleep. So I really like to read Janice's Facebook page, because you like to post all these little things, what you're thankful for in life. And it's very encouraging. And so I would like to encourage all of us today, just take a few minutes, write down a few things that you're thankful for. Don't write things that you can think of right now, but things that you usually take it for granted. Just write it down and learn to give thanks. So you see, we do not have a shortage of reasons to be joyful in this life. What we have is a shortage of gratitude to see the blessings. But life itself is already a gift from God, but only the true monotheist worshiper can embrace all that life is giving us with a sense of grace and without compromising on the standard of justice and righteousness. And so I want to, this is coming to the end of our lesson, I guess the end of our service. And it's like going back to the beginning when Gwendolyn was saying the same thing in your welcome about what you're thankful for, all these little things in life. And thank you for opening us up with that. So you see, the monotheist way of living is a courageous way of living. And that's the best way to live. We are all invited to live life this way. So may you always walk humbly with your God. And may the Lord keep you in your going out, in your coming in. And may the Lord grant you rest and give you peace.